Brilliant. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Enabling Water Smart Communities Spring Webinar Series. So my name is Kat Moncrieff, and I'm from CIWEM, and I'm going to be hosting today's webinar. So this is the second webinar in the Project Spring Webinar Series. The aim of this webinar series is to share progress with and findings from the project's enabling actions, and those are seeking to overcome barriers to water smart approaches in new housing developments. And this webinar is the second in the series, and we're going to be focusing on community stewardship in new housing developments, and it's also going to explore different financing and funding models for stewardship and also integrated water management in new housing developments. So CIWEM are hosting today's webinar. CIWEM lead the communications and engagement part of the Enabling Water Smart Communities project, and CIWEM, if you don't know, is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Okay, so before we kick off, just a few general housekeeping points. So this is being recorded. If you have any technical issues and need help, then please raise your hand and use the chat feature on Zoom to let us know what the problem is. If you've got any questions or comments about the content, then please use the Q&A function for that, and we'll be taking questions and comments at 2 points throughout the webinar. So it's the chat feature for technical issues and the Q&A feature for your questions. Okay, so let me introduce our panel and speakers today. So you've got me, I'm Kat Moncrieff from CIWEM, and then Stuart Edwards, who is the Project Delivery Manager at United Utilities, and he's been leading on the stewardship part of Enabling Water Smart Communities. Then I'm very happy to have with us Tom Chance, the Chief Executive of the Community Land Trust Network, and he's been supporting the work we've been doing on stewardship. And then also very happy to have with us Stephen Lloyd, who's going to lead us through the funding and finance work of the project. Stephen is a director at Arup, and he leads Arup's Global Strategic Services for Water, and he's got over 30 years of experience across the water sector, ranging from business planning to investment and finance. And I should also flag Nathan from CIWEM, who's with us today and is going to help with any technical issues. Okay, so quick run through of the agenda. So I'm going to start with introducing the Enabling Water Smart Communities project very briefly. Then Tom and Stuart will take us through the project's stewardship work. Then we'll have a break from presenting for a few questions, and then Stephen will take us through the funding and finance work, and then we'll pick up other questions at the end. So a little bit about the Enabling Water Smart Communities project. So it's an Ofwat innovation project, and it's exploring the relationship between integrated water management, community practices, and housing development. And there are a number of different partners involved. Sorry, did I miss a slide? Missed something there. Yeah. A number of different partners involved that you can see there includes a number of water companies, academic research institutions, and also the Community Land Trust Network and Arup, who are with us here today. So very briefly, what do we mean by a water smart community? It's essentially where water-related assets and systems such as rainwater harvesting and sustainable drainage are included at the design stage and built into the kind of fabrication of a place. But it's not just about the hardware, it's also about the software. It's about members of the community, and it's about those members of the community understanding, valuing, and taking ownership for those assets and systems. And so why do we need this project? So Enabling Water Smart Communities is all about addressing the shared issues faced by the water and housing sectors. And you can see those illustrated on those news items in the slide. So it includes water scarcity. Oh, I need to do some movement. Sorry, it's gone dark in here. So those issues include water scarcity, flooding, but also pollution, sewer related issues as well. The project is focusing on overcoming these issues in a holistic and integrated way, and specifically on how we can mainstream water smart approaches such as water reuse, rainwater harvesting, and sustainable drainage in all new homes, and ultimately unlock sustainable growth. So the project has a number of enabling actions which are set out here. So these were identified during the initial discovery phase of the project, where we did a number of case study reviews and interviews, and we identified what the blockers were to enabling water smart approaches and how to overcome those blockers. And those are the enabling actions that you can see there. Today we're focusing on community-based stewardship, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, and also finance and funding in the top right-hand corner. So I'm now going to hand over to Stuart to delve into some of the stewardship work. Over to you, Stu.
Thanks, Kat. Can I have the next slide, please? So the project we're going to talk you through is where we've got up to with the stewardship project. And the stewardship project, the work stream, is really a progression of one of three proposed enabling action areas, which Kat's previously mentioned. These projects are live areas of experimentation, each exploring the design challenge connected to the themes of assets, value, and stewardship. The project has brought together really many cross-sector expertise, which are really set out to explore how might we create a sustainable community-led stewardship models for integrated water management that empowers diverse sectors to adopt, operate, and maintain assets effectively. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Tom Chance, the Chief Executive of the Community Land Trust Network, who's going to talk through some of the case studies and some scopes for drivers for change as well. Up to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Stu. So Kat described some of the drivers in terms of water, but one of the things we noted at the start of this is that there's a wider discussion about stewardship beyond water for other assets in general. And around the time that this project got started, the Competition and Markets Authority concluded a house building study of the wider housing market, in which they noted that currently around 9 in 10 housing developments are being stewarded by private companies that they felt were causing such detriment to consumers that that model should be banned and that everything should go back to local authority adoption and control. And that is in parallel with political concerns being raised in Parliament, with the government itself, governments themselves over the recent years pledging to tackle these questions, and a lot of work by other commissions and institutions looking at stewardship. So we try to situate the water question within the wider question of stewardship. Next slide. One of the reasons we then look at community land trusts is that if we're thinking in terms of community-led stewardship, this is an established community-led stewardship model that is legally defined, that has explicit duties for community land trusts to further social, economic, and environmental interests. And there's quite a bit of evidence in relation to other environmental questions, such as energy or the circular economy, that the governance model and the duties and the sort of the legal framework of a community land trust leads to better environmental outcomes. And so we're interested in whether that would equally apply with water, and if water were integral to the stewardship role of a CLT for larger housing developments. And also that there's a lot of practice out there already around how you layer in and connect together community land trusts as the steward with entities using its assets, managing its assets, which we could see with that transfer to water. Next slide. This also connects with some related research projects we've been involved in. One looking at place stewardship in general, a piece of work that we published in January, working with Dark Matter Labs and our European network, looking at 5 case studies, some of which fed into the water work, and also work we've been doing looking at new towns, which Stu and others have been feeding into, thinking, how do you integrate community-led stewardship into new towns, and how again might water feature in relation to that? And this is really connecting into significant interest within the government and Homes England in these alternative models of community-led stewardship. Next slide. So the first case study we looked at is a 500 home development in East Cambridgeshire, which is where a community land trust will be the steward of all of the open space, some of the green and blue infrastructure, including water assets, as well as affordable housing and some commercial freeholds and other assets within this development. And this was really driven by the council, which has been very supportive of community land trusts and has had a very strong civic involvement, from the community being a client on the master plan, overseeing the development, to taking up the stewardship role. Next slide. And on the non-housing side, so there are these, in some ways, this is a relatively conventional approach, just with a slightly different governance structure of a community land trust, in that the Section 106 agreement and a management fee provide the financing for the CLT to maintain these assets. And they'll be initially managed by the developer, Bellway, and then handed over to the CLT, along with some other assets like allotments. And we're interested in this arrangement. How does the community take on these assets, and how do they ensure that some of these water challenges are effectively addressed, given that everything else is kind of, as it were, bog standard for housing development? Next slide. Another example is a quite different scheme in the city centre of Leeds, which is being developed by a kind of B Corp developer called Situ, which wanted to develop an innovation district demonstrating different ways of tackling climate challenges, in which there's a community land trust involved and other stakeholders. And they've taken a quite interesting approach to how they try and do the stewardship of these assets. Next slide. So they set up a new community interest company, which is really a utility provider for the homes, providing energy, water, and data to the households on the site. All of the people moving in, if you buy a home in this development, you buy a £3,000 bond, which goes into this kick, and that kick then has the uses this financing to try to service all of those different bits of utility infrastructure. So again, we're interested in looking at how do they utilize this capability to try to make this a more water smart community. And this is again mixed tenure, so you've got shared owners and renters as well as market homeowners part of this kick. And again, what's the role of the developer which set up this company in making sure this is stewarded? Next slide. And these are some of the key insights from the work to date. Some of these are just general challenges with stewardship and aren't specific to water. So for instance, often you get really good examples of brilliant stewardship developments in areas with quite high land values and a lot of development value, where you can get a large endowment or commuted sum through Section 106. You can get high estate charges, and you can do really exciting things. Trying to do it in areas of very low land value, where development is already quite viable, simply makes it more challenging to achieve a really high standard of stewardship. Similarly, estate management models simply aren't really invested in managing water assets effectively. One of the interesting things is that although community-led stewardship has shown that by giving communities more control, they tend to bring environmental considerations more to the fore. They kind of give them a greater priority, and they're interested in how they try to do that. What came across is that they also aren't really interested in the practical end of managing water assets. It's highly complex, some it's quite regulated. They'd frankly rather that a water company or someone else did that. And so there's kind of an interesting question, can you layer things? What is the relationship between those companies and community stewards? And how do stewards ensure that then that isn't leading to the same problem we see with management companies, where tech just gets turned off because there's no financial incentive to keep the stuff going? Even if that were the case, it's also just a blind spot when you ask communities what environmental issues they're most concerned about. Water doesn't come high on the list. So there's a need to think about how we raise the profile of water as an issue with communities and with those stewardship bodies. There are some challenges because of these, in taking some of the learnings from community-led stewardship in other areas to water specifically. Some of the complexities in water are quite different to wider questions of open space management or housing management. And then there's also this question around the transition. And in those two examples I mentioned, Bellway maintaining assets for 12 months before they're handed off to the CLT, the developer in Leeds maintaining an involvement with the community interest company. How do you transition governance and responsibilities between the different stakeholders, particularly that point of landowner or developer handing off to a community steward? And what this comes down to is that really, in order to address all of these things, you need to consider this at the inception, at the earliest possible stage, to be thinking about stewardship and designing that in, which so Stuart will describe then a blueprint as to how we think about what questions are you raising and what sort of things do you need to consider at the very early stages of developments, so that you set yourselves up to ensure that water is elevated as an issue. It's thought of in terms of the stewardship body. It's understood how that stewardship body is going to discharge its responsibilities in relation to water and how you get the benefits of the community-led stewardship model. Next slide, I think I'll hand over to Stu at this point.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Tom, for that. So what we're going to talk through now is really some of the early prototypes we'd like to test and how those could benefit key stakeholders. So if we look at the model we've got before us there, the model is initiated and formulated at the early stages of development. Early stage of development blueprint to result in an incorporated legal entity. So that's prior to construction or completion. So business ready to adopt and take ownership of communal water and land assets from developers. The model can include ownership of complementary income raising assets such as affordable housing, community energy schemes, natural landscape, woodlands, sites of special scientific interest, workspace, community facilities. So there's opportunities here for wealth creation as well for the community. The governance structure allows for not just homeowners, but leaseholders, tenants, and people that live around a development to all have a membership and a share in the CLT, the Community Land Trust. Other stakeholders, such as developers, local authorities, water companies, can also have the option of a share membership in the CLT to share with guidance and other aspects as well. All shareholders appoint a board of directors where residents are often the majority. The board of directors are responsible for contracting the management of their assets and ensuring the future investment in perpetuity, which is key to this process. Next slide, please, Cal. And here I want to talk through really the prototype model and the benefits and how it's applicable to stakeholders. So starting off with the community, increased democratic involvement in ownership and management of water assets. The non-for-profit status to keep estate fees low, which we don't see in other areas where estate fees have been increasing or has been clear what people are paying for. And there's an opportunity here for water assets to contribute to a sense of place and well-being, which is absolutely important for valuing water as part of the entire system. The landowner, community buy-in and sustainable approach to water from beginning to assist with planning approvals for new developments will assist the landowner in sales. The optional associate membership to influence will basically mean that landowners retain a role within the community land trust and partnership and act as a partnership vehicle for development. It could have benefits to farmers, for example, selling off land and having that stake in the longer term with managing assets in perpetuity. Then the water companies, community interest in ownership and management of water assets in perpetuity is pretty much key as it assists in tackling flood risk and potable water consumption, which are all challenges going forward, as Kat's previously mentioned. The legal entity can therefore enter into adoption agreements with water companies, which is a lot more straightforward than some other aspects that are currently available. Optional associate membership to influence, as mentioned before, this gives the ability for people to engage with water companies and community land trust board, but also to share information to improve future legal agreements and to share advice. Local authorities, the assets managed in perpetuity, so they don't require local authority adoption, as we're aware of the challenges the local authorities are facing and the current trend over the last 10 years for private estate management systems to be put in place. Engagement of community in the planning process is pretty much key for getting people on board with the developments that's going forward and to make life easier for a number of stakeholders and being clear what is the purpose of this and what are the benefits to the community in helping people get through the planning process. It's scalable across several sites within a local authority boundary. Developers, again, help with community buy-in and the sustainable approach to water from the very beginning, will assist with planning approvals for new development, ability to unlock housing in areas restricted, potentially by water supply or by flooding, alternatives to estate management, really, and the state management approaches, and can really meet, as Tom mentioned earlier, the Competition and Mergers Authority recommendations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Kat. No one before that, Kat, sorry. That's it. So we've got this provisional model, and we've put together a stewardship blueprint, and the blueprint was a synthesis of the research that identifies what needs to happen at the development of a new site to enable water stewardship. It highlights the different stages of site development process, the stages and sub-stages, and the barriers to stewardship we've recorded to date. It relates to new build estate management, not the retrofitting of subs. The resource is designed for use in a workshop setting, really, to help facilitate the dialogue and collective decision making with stakeholders involved in house building and placemaking. And what we're looking to use this for, really, is for during the session, participants can identify where the sites they're working on and where they're up to in the development process, and how it aligns with their perspectives towards potential interventions to improve current asset management and advise site-specific water stewardship. The needs and conditions of particular sites will be unique, not one model fits all, but may share emerging patterns or related challenges. So what we've collected here is a series of all the different stages. From our research and our synthesis, we've then identified the various barriers to stewardship, and then all the different stages, the key questions that we'd very much like to ask and drill into in more detail. And this really touches on some of the core aspects of water stewardship principles: the care and respect for water as a common good, consider water as an integral part of good placemaking, and water is essential for the delivery of wider outcomes. Next slide, please, Kat. So where did we get to? In summary, we're finding the current estate management approaches don't satisfy the current requirements, let alone for the future. And we need the estates to be managed as effectively as possible due to the challenges we face around water. And the new interventions are likely to be required. So it needs to be really clear on who is stewarding and who's owning and who's managing. We're really keen to increasing citizen involvement in water stewardship. It's difficult. However, we have an approach, but it needs to be tested on site and designed in detail, such as with legal models. So one of the sort of asks that people joining the call is, if you're hearing this presentation, please have a look at the detail the documents are published on the website, and please come in and suggest where you may have a site very early on. We'd like to start really the planning stage and just before to start talking to you about this and how we can move this forward. Another point really, that whilst industry experts have been engaging with stewardship, there's a lot of work to do to bring examples into mainstream house building. And as Tom mentioned before, water doesn't seem to be on the main agenda with stewardship at large. So there's people and individuals who recognise water, recognise the risks of water, but we don't really see it from a wider stewardship point of view as a key aspect. Just really touching on a few things as well. We held a workshop that many of you attended, and thank you for that. That the majority of you wanted to engage further with water stewardship, so do we. And really, I just wanted to give you a few key takeaways. Stewardship, we know it isn't easy. The CLTN approach is actually quite simple. We talk about legal agreements and everything else in detail, but it's quite simple to approach. CLTN, yes, this is an innovation study, but CLTN is already in practice, so we're looking to expand that practice. It's not something completely alien to the framework that we've got. And we think the CLTN approach and helping us with water stewardship is probably going to be a more reliable platform, or certainly a platform that can help us with the challenges that we're facing. So what I'd really like to do is get in touch, open up the debate more and where we can help each other. But we're really keen, as I said before, to find opportunities up and coming with new sites so we can test and answer the questions and evolve the blueprints so we can work towards better stewardship models. And that concludes the stewardship presentation. Are there any questions at this juncture?
Thank you very much, Stu. So we've got a few minutes now to take any questions that are coming through. But just while we wait for questions, I just wanted to highlight back on that slide there, that QR code. If you scan that, that will take you through to the stewardship outputs, including the blueprint that Stuart talked about. And as Stuart said, please do have a look and get in touch if you know of any developments or places where we might be able to test some of these ideas. So I don't think there's anything that's come through on the Q&A, but we did actually have a couple of questions that came through in advance. So I wonder whether we look at those. So one from Charlotte Llewellyn, who asked, what opportunities are there for integrating water stewardship in any future generations of new town? I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, Tom and Stuart. Have you been in touch with any of the new towns' work going on or thinking, planning?
Yes, I mentioned earlier in one of my slides some work we did, which Stuart was involved in, and we had a workshop earlier this year with about 80 stakeholders across private sector, like developers, landowners, councils, planners, and with people from the MHCLG task force there. We've been working with them because the housing minister asked us basically what would we say should be the potential of these community-led models in new towns. And so we were interested in what's the connection between that question and then the water question. What came out of that event was really this sense that new towns will fail unless you have good stewardship, and that stewardship probably needs to be a community-led form of stewardship to create really successful places with people at the heart of it. And so, although the scale is obviously greater, you're talking 10,000 to 60,000 homes over a longer time scale, the principles that we've described here and on the blueprint that Stuart described would apply equally. There's questions of scale, like do you have one stewardship vehicle for the whole of a new town, or do you break it up? And there's lots of detailed questions, but the principle could apply. And we're really trying to now work to get the task force members and officials working on that to integrate this into the kind of prospectus and some materials they put out there, so that those people who are successful this summer in bidding for new town status and locations, that's part of the brief at the outset, get stewardship right, and for stewardship to include questions like water.
Yeah.
And just so I can just jump on the back of that, thanks, Tom. I think one of the key points that came about was that when we think about water and stewardship, that we've got to think about it in the other sectors as well. That water can't just be seen in isolation; it's got to be thought of with all the other utilities as well, and all the other challenges. It's all got to be wrapped together. But we certainly need water on that agenda, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And back on the question of scale, there was a question that's come in from Andy Dean. So at the opposite end of the spectrum, is there a minimum scale of development where this could be applicable?
I think we've seen the other area of this Enabling Water Smart Communities project, which is looking at assets and financing, give an answer to that, which is that some of the technologies, some of the ideas simply aren't cost effective below a certain scale. So some of the site-wide rainwater harvesting, for example, I think off the top of my head, it was something like 100 homes and above, it starts to become cost effective, and below that it's quite expensive. So there's probably some limitations around that. The stewardship model itself, having our community land trust that own 2 homes, so the governance model can apply at a very local level, but it's whether you can then bring in the kind of water technologies and the maintenance
The
of
assets.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We've got something that's come through the chat from Todd. What are the risks of the CLT model? If the worst happens, what are the recovery and resilience strategies? That's a great question.
Yeah, it would be the same with any kind of stewardship model, any kind of company. If it's not local authority adopting stuff or water companies, then it's the same question that applies. And it comes back to some of the multi-stakeholder model that Stuart described about the way in which the local authority and others support it to be run effectively. If the stewardship trust fails in some way, then the same question arises to where do the assets go? How do you try and resuscitate something? But one of the things that we do is then also provide a membership network for those trusts to try to support them and train them in good governance and operational questions and so on, and ensure they're getting that national support as well as strong ongoing support from their commercial partners and their local authority.
So the network, the CLT and the network is really important in providing that kind of guidance and support with those issues and risks.
Yeah, so one of the reasons the CMA was critical of private management companies and resident management companies was the risk that you just don't have the expertise and the support, and you've got all these different developments where suddenly, you build 200 homes and the residents theoretically have to suddenly take control of things, and it's hard to motivate people even to come out and spend their evenings discussing the contract for the people, cutting the grass or dealing with the roadworks or what have you. The residents kind of think, isn't this what the council's supposed to do? So there's clearly a problem with this, and one of the things we're interested in is if you work at a slightly larger scale with a slightly more proactive and interesting remit of a community land trust, does that support more people to come out? Does it encourage more people to get involved with it? Also, this question of layering and relationships, that you're not saying the CLT has to take charge of water assets on its own. It's how does it do that in relation to the water company and other stakeholders, so that you're making a reasonable ask of the community and then reducing the chances of, if failure happens, it's not catastrophic. It's just you need to sort out some governance questions.
Yeah. And I think what you were saying there partly answers a question that we had coming in previously from Bill Lovett, who asked, what's the possibility of support in future for community projects or pilots? And I think part of the answer to that question is in the funding and finance. So I wonder whether that's a good point now to move on to Stephen's presentation, which is delving into that area of different funding and finance models for these community-based projects. So, Stephen, I will move the slides on. Okay, can everyone see that? Is that finance and funding? And over to you, Stephen.
Yep. Great, thank you. Stuart, I don't know if you wanted to make an introduction. In the interest of time, shall I just dive on?
Please, yeah. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Bill, we performed a work stream in parallel to the work that was just been done around community land trusts. And what we explored was different other sources of funding and finance that may sometimes sit alongside a community land trust, or maybe in other times be an alternative. And what we've heard there is that community ownership and community engagement is absolutely critical. But depending on the scale, sometimes the interventions or the cost of interventions might be beyond the reach of existing householders, or there might be interventions that require significant ongoing operation and maintenance, which again might require other partners and other funding sources and finance sources to sit alongside it. So what we've done is we've looked around global practice to try and see if there are other examples that might be adopted into the UK. So next slide, please. So I'll skip over this one really because this is the how. We did a literature review, we had some workshops, we had a lot of interviews, but let's move on to a bit of the meat of what we found. Next slide, please. What we did is we thought about the different types of interventions that you might do around a site and around a community, and to some of the interventions such as rainwater harvesting or sustainable urban drainage, or sort of a wider scale catchment management for attenuating water, etc. We thought about those different types of interventions and we looked, are there examples of how those have been funded elsewhere, or are there examples of financing? And if you just think about funding and finance for a moment, if you think about buying a house, your funding is the income you use to repay your mortgage. The finance is the loan you get from the bank to pay for the original upfront purchase, but you can only repay if your income is big enough. And from a house builder's point of view, they're confident that they can build the house knowing somebody can buy it because the finance is in place. So it just gives everybody the confidence and the mechanism to do those things. But you need both funding, the income stream, and the finance when appropriate. And so what we did when we looked at all these different examples around the world, some from the UK, some from elsewhere, we looked at are there examples where they've been applied to water? Could they be adaptable and applicable here? And are there some UK examples already in play? So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to go through each of those in turn, but we just up to the next slide. So again, those were the previous funding typologies, and then we looked at financing ones. So going through each in turn, grants. Grants is a great way of securing money for nothing, really. So if you can access grants, great. The problem with grants is there's just not enough of them, and sometimes they may come with conditions that might not be appropriate to the scenario. So grants, if available, should always be part of the solution, but it's unlikely that there'll be sufficient sources of finance from either public sector or private benefactors to be the full solution. So next slide, please. Similarly, endowments, so rather than grants, which is just a one-off gift, endowments come where you might put some money aside, invest in it, and you use the income generated for that to invest in the activities, but the capital stays the same, stays there. So it's a non-profit investment based on a philanthropic basis, could be a public or private entity. So again, if endowments are available, could be a great part of the picture, unlikely to be the full solution, and sometimes may come with conditions that may not be flexible for the situation, but a very useful thing to draw on if you can. Next one, please. Fees, penalties and fines. There's two angles to this. So we've seen examples in the US where people are being either penalised or incentivised for doing interventions through fees for providing a service, or penalties if they don't, which could be a source. The governance around that is quite complex to establish. We also see an opportunity in the UK. There's a large number of fines for water companies that's actually going into the Treasury. Could that actually be used in combination with something else, we'll talk about in a moment, as a funding source for actually interventions around sustainable benefit rather than just going into general tax? It'd be good to explore that across the sector as to whether people think that would be put to a better use. Next one, please. Market-based models. So there are a lot of outcomes from doing different interventions around nature, and people might be prepared to pay for those outcomes. So this is what we call payment for ecosystem services, where you create a nature market. Biodiversity net gain is perhaps the best well-known one of these. Local authorities such as Warwickshire are very actively using the benefits in biodiversity net gain and linking that to planning conditions to reinvest and create a source of finance for interventions. Other markets are emerging around water neutrality, or maybe you pay people to use less water. So this is a long-term solution with some governance wrapped in, where you actually have somebody managing that market and capturing the benefit from somebody who's prepared to pay for it. So actually very encouraging, definitely part of the answer. Whether it's big enough to be the whole solution, not quite sure, but definitely something that's proving to be very successful and definitely worth further exploration. Next one, please. Last mile model. This has been applied both in energy and somewhere else, where you think about who's making the connection, who's doing the activity. And this is really bringing an operator on board who might have the capability and the local skills base to actually tackle the ongoing maintenance rather than that just being on the householders. A community-based trust could be the beneficiary of that, could work alongside it. But if there's a significant amount of work to do, and for the long term, and for duration, and which will survive changes in different householders, setting up something like the new appointment and variations model, the NAV model that's already used for connections and for adoption of some SUDs. We really think this is a model that could be further extended and applied and really researched more in this area. Next one, please. Tax credits and exemptions. So we've seen in different countries, Germany, the UK, US example, where people are given a tax benefit if they do a specific intervention, such as removing all the permanent hard surfaces on their drives, etc. And also models where people at a state level in some US states are actually giving reductions on some of their state tax payments if they actually are more water efficient. It's a great idea. It really requires government buy-in and government policy. And at a local level, the UK local authorities and combined authorities don't yet have enough devolve powers to be able to do this because they're not tax raising. And I doubt many local authorities really have the sufficient funding to do this out of council tax. It only really works for other fiscal taxes. So it needs to be either adopted at a state level, doesn't really work in a local level in the way it does in some other countries. Next one, please. Water bill discounts and rebates. We've seen numerous water companies providing incentives for people to become water efficient. We definitely encourage this. It feels like it should always be part of the answer. It's to incentivise change in behaviour. This combined with other funding sources could be really important. So we'd encourage this. It feels like it's part of the solution rather than the only solution. Next one, please. Revolving funds. So lots of people, when we engaged and talked about the idea of could you create a fund which is effectively not for profit, where interventions are managed on behalf of a fund. The benefit of those comes back to the fund, and you can reinvest that funding into that. It's a great idea in principle, quite complex to set up unless you've got a real body that's driven to do it. We'd really like to try and see if there could be a UK water company through Ofwat decision, through maybe for an innovation fund, of could there be a UK revolving fund that does help provide support to local developers or local sites that are wanting to do this, where the gap finance is provided by the fund. So definitely something we think merits further investigation. Next one, please. People talk about finance all the time and say, well, can we just raise a bond and we'll be all solved? Actually, it's not the finance that's usually the problem, it's the funding. So who can pay this back? If you've got a guaranteed income stream, you can raise some finance. Green bonds tend to actually most often be raised by corporations like Anglian Water, and it's just part of their corporate investment. So they're raising a lot of money and they're investing in a whole load of interventions, and they're demonstrating sustainability as an outcome. It's not really very often used for specific small-scale investments. Cities can raise bonds, so US cities raise bonds, and sometimes for this area, but that market doesn't really exist to the same extent in the UK. So bond finance could be applicable. It's expensive to raise. The scale of intervention is much bigger than usually applied in this area. So we think it's probably a bit of a red herring in this instance. Next one, please. Forgivable loans. This is quite a nice idea. Works in the US. This is somebody loans you the money. If you do what you say you do, you don't have to pay it back. If you don't do what you say you're going to do, you do have to pay it back. So this again is where perhaps you might have a local authority that's responsible for a lot of delivery. It's putting the onus onto the household and incentivizing them to do it, and willing to give them a credit if they don't. That all requires probably an authority that's got significant devolved powers over and above what they exist in the UK, and an ability not to take the finance back. And I don't think many local authorities in the UK are in the position to do that. So it's a nice idea. It would be great to try and explore it. Not quite sure it fits into the UK. Next one, please. This final one is around green mortgages. A lot of people talk about could you actually use green mortgages for doing energy interventions or water interventions. Concept here is that your loan provider gives you a bit of a discount if your house is energy efficient or water efficient. The challenge behind this to water is, are the savings really enough? So if you're paying a couple of £1,000 a month in your mortgage, and say you reduce your water usage by 10-15% by putting some water efficient uses in there, you might be saving 10-15% of £400 or £500. Is that really enough to incentivise the discount against the mortgage? Doesn't really feel like the savings are big enough. Whereas in energy, those savings could be really significant, where you've got energy costs of a few £1,000s. So it doesn't really feel like the payback's there well enough. And I'm not sure there's a direct link to the value of the property. So there's not the same incentive for mortgage providers here. So interesting idea. In reality, I can't really see it working for water interventions. Okay, next slide. So I realised that was a very fast run through of all the things we've seen. What we did is we sort of took stock of all those and said, okay, well, which of those are easy to go, ready in the market, you should just adopt and apply to projects, and which ones could really be scaled and aggregated. You could do this rather than on one-off projects or individual households, which could be used to drive thousands and thousands of properties and thousands of interventions at a larger scale. And what we found is that, as you'll see, as I was talking through, some were sort of hinting they weren't quite as applicable. So grants and endowments, great. If you can get them, always try and use them. Unlikely to be scalable to have enough impact across the whole of the UK. Things like tax credits and exemptions prove to be scalable in specific markets, but aren't really suitable in the UK. And then what we have is a cluster in the sort of top right-hand box. So in this diagram, the further out you are to that top right-hand corner, the sort of more likely it is to be able to impact at scale and adopt easily. So what we've done is we've identified there isn't currently a silver bullet. No one answers in that top right-hand box, but there are, we think they're encouragingly close. So if we jump to the final slide, what we've done is we've made a recommendation from our work that as a sector, we perhaps ought to explore 3 of these areas together to see how they could work in combination with community land trusts, where we might use market-based models. If somebody's prepared to pay for the benefit and the ecosystem benefit, then how do we capture that? Allow the value to be allocated to that individual and they can pay for it, whether that's a corporate or a water company or a builder prepared to pay for those benefits. That seems sensible. If the obligations are long-term and onerous for maintaining these assets, is there a professional entity that could come on and take that on board and work with the local communities to deliver that? So can we use this sort of last mile model or new appointment variation model where you create a regulated asset base and a long-term return, and you've got a long-term provider that survives all the house sales and is there for the duration, providing that service backup so that the householders don't need to do it themselves. And the final one is, could the industry come together and use various sources of finance, for example, fees, penalties, fines, water bill rebates, etc., as a series of income streams for a fund to be delivered on behalf of the industry to work with developers and adopt these assets and manage the interventions on behalf of them all. And that could be a fund perhaps similar to the kind of innovation funding we're seeing out of what that's run on behalf of the industry. We think there's real merit in that. We'd love to explore it. And we think those 3 models all have merits that could work alongside each other in tandem with the ideas that we were hearing about earlier in the presentation. So if anybody's got an interest in those things, would like to talk about it, great. And we're really keen and hope that these things are picked up and explored further and maybe taken into pilot type examples in the years ahead. That's the presentation, Kat.
Thank you very much, Stephen. You went through a lot there and really interesting, and great that you've gone through all those different models and then managed to come up with
a bit of myth busting partly along the way, because people think when we were doing the interviews and things, people say, oh, surely the answer is green mortgage, or surely the answer is these forgivable loans. In concept, yes, but when you try and apply them, are they deliverable? Does the governance work? Can they be applied? The answer to a lot of these things is not really. Governance is the key, and the ability to actually have these things underwritten, strong business case, clear governance, clear return, actually makes some of these things just disappear.
Yeah. And that distinction you made between finance and funding is really important as well.
People just get that mixed up all the time. They think if they can get the finance, we're okay, but if you can't afford to repay it, nobody's going to give you it.
You're in trouble. That's great. And Stephen, that QR code there, does that take us through to the finance?
It does. There's a more detailed report that people can take at their leisure. So rather than having me trotting at 1,000 miles an hour through these things, but there's a report that goes through all that detail in much more and highlights a bit more how we actually made the assessments. So people can access that through the QR code, yes.
That's brilliant. Great. So I might leave that up then. Just looking at the next slide. So the next slide has got, oh gosh, they're jumping around, but I might just leave that one up for a moment. So we've got a bit of time for some further questions now, either around what Stephen's spoken about on finance and funding, or feel free to ask about the community stewardship work as well. There's a question here in the Q&A. What are your thoughts on the current structure of Ofwat's environmental incentives for new housing developers? What are the possible improvements needed to guidance to water companies on how to structure these, and how much difference you think they will make to sustainable water management? So Stephen, did you look at those environmental incentives as part of your work? Or do you see that as quite a separate thing?
It is a bit separate. We were looking at sort of what's the external sources of funding and finance over and above those to actually fund the interventions. So I don't know if
I can jump in there, Kat.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say,
Kat.
Stuart, that the project has done a bit. So yeah, do come in.
Sorry. So the environmental incentives, as Steve said, this was looking at beyond that. But for current environmental incentives and water companies, there is continuous view to how that structure can be improved. So already Ofwat's released clear reviews of how it should be applied, the environmental incentives. And funnily enough, Enabling Water Smart Communities is doing a piece of work on that as well, as another separate project which I'm leading on, which is to look at all the different standards. A lot of these different assets have different standards. Some of them are referring to British standard, some of them are referring to different types of capacities and how they should be applied. And what we're going to do is really work with the industry and with key stakeholders, developers and consultants to look at how we can make those standards and align them to a sort of a best practice with something that can be communicated out to those who benefit from those standards in simple communication terms. So it's a little bit embryonic at the moment, but if you are interested in learning more about environmental incentives or potential changes, that there is a project underway, please by all means drop me a line and I will be in touch as we start to formulate working groups on that to tackle some of those questions.
Thanks, Stu. Okay, I can't see anything else that's come through the Q&A, unless I'm missing something in the chat. Do check out the chat though, because we put some links in there to the various outputs. Given we don't have any more questions, I was just thinking actually about, you know, the importance of community engagement in the future of water smart communities. I wondered whether you had any thoughts on, you know, how to do that from the very first point, you know, how to work with developers in terms of with house buyers and things to try and get people more engaged from the outset in the concept of stewardship and water as well. I wondered whether Tom or Stuart, you had any specific thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can just cover that. So it's covered partly in the case studies research I've put a link to in the chat, which I mentioned, which fed then into this work we've been doing with Stu and co on water. And there are kind of tried and tested strategies that, you know, in terms of engaging existing local communities and establishing a community stewardship body and it's worth doing it at an early stage and reaching out to, you know, anywhere you go, there'll be existing community organizations and associations that you can engage with. I think one of the things that makes this approach distinctive is not really thinking in terms of community engagement per se, but thinking in terms of community leadership and community stewardship. And so inviting people to say, well, you know, you can take control of these assets, you can be sitting around the table as a decision maker with these other stakeholders, and you can be thinking proactively actually about, you know, what would you do if you had all these assets and you have this land, and how would you try to make this a more sustainable community in the round, and how would you address water as part of that, and how would you, for example, support and facilitate much more participation? And we know there are lots of local environmental groups. People get involved all the time in their weekends and evenings, and looking after rivers and watercourses and creating wildlife ponds and so on, and really unlocking that by giving the community the confidence and the capability to take that kind of a role beyond simply being engaged in what other people might be able to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think that distinction between engagement and leadership is really important to highlight. So I can't see anything else in the chat. So I think it'd be worth, though, sharing the wider webinar series. So we had one last week, which was about collaboration between institutions, and we'll be sharing the video of that on our website shortly. Then we've had this one today on community water stewardship and also finance and funding. The one next week is about the water efficient homes guide, which the Good Homes Alliance are developing in collaboration with the project. So that's next week, and that's going to trail that guide, which is actually being launched in July. The webinar will also provide a bit of an update on some of the work we've been doing around community-based water reuse. On the 28th of May, we have a webinar on climate resilient gardens, looking into a potential accreditation scheme there. And then a bit of a break, but then on the 11th of June, we've got the last one in the series, which is about engaging the public in water smart communities. And I think there might be some read across from some of the things we've discussed here, actually, in terms of community stewardship and leadership. So yes, do go and register, go to the Enabling Water Smart Communities website. You'll also find all of the outputs coming through from the project there. And just, I guess, as a final kind of call to action, as Stuart said, please go and look into the outputs that we've developed, including on stewardship. And if you are aware of a development or a site where you think some of these ideas could be tested, then please do get in touch. So that just remains for me to say thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much to everyone else for listening, and hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you.
Lovely. Bye.